The storm rose over the North Sea like a living barricade, its towers of cloud stacked in black, churning layers that swallowed every scrap of moonlight. Radar operators at the coastal station watched the outlines of an RAF squadron returning from a night mission, their echoes sliding steadily across the screen, until the moment they touched the storm wall. In a single blink, every signal vanished. No fading trace, no distortion, no debris pattern. 1 second the squadron was there, the next it had been erased from the sky. Inside the storm, the pilots felt the world tighten around them. Static hissed across their headsets, needles jumped on their panels, and lightning flickered so close it colored the cockpit glass with ghostly blue veins. One pilot swore he saw the clouds part into a hollow space, a strange pocket where the turbulence suddenly eased. Another glimpsed a second aircraft drifting beside him, barely a silhouette, before it dissolved back into the dark folds of the Thunderhead. What looked to the ground like a catastrophic loss was something far stranger. The disappearance followed a method almost no one in the Air Force understood. A wartime trick buried in the storm's electrical heart, mapped and mastered by a single weather analyst who believed thunderclouds held secrets radar could not penetrate. The men who survived that night said the storm hid them because one man knew where its blind spots lived. Keep watching to find out how he taught pilots to vanish inside the sky. In the final years of the war, when reconnaissance lines grew tighter and German radar nets stretched like invisible fences across the continent, the Royal Air Force faced a problem no engine upgrade could solve. Their bombers were too exposed. Every approach path, every return route, every deviation in course appeared as a flicker on enemy scopes. Weather offered only limited protection. Storms could scatter formations, break morale, and tear aircraft apart long before they shielded anything. At an Eastern England airfield, Flight Lieutenant Arthur Hemsley studied these same storms with an intensity that unsettled his colleagues. He was a quiet, unfailingly precise meteorological officer, known for notes written in small, perfect handwriting and for arriving at the operations room long before dawn. Where most saw storm fronts as obstacles, Hemsley stared at the chaotic swirls of cumulonimbus clouds and sensed patterns worth chasing. The radar logs fascinated him most, moments where thunderheads produced strange, uneven readings, thin slices of empty space inside an otherwise solid echo. At first, the anomalies were dismissed as calibration faults. Wartime machines failed often, after all. But Hemsley kept gathering data. He traced similar gaps across different stations, different storms, different days. When a violent squall one evening produced another identical absence in the radar return, he carried the logs straight to squadron leader Thomas Greaves. Greaves listened reluctantly, then more carefully, as Hemsley laid out a pattern the pilots had never been taught to consider. A technique was forming, dangerous, untested, and compelling. Like and subscribe for more stories like this, and watch how this discovery turned into a wartime gamble. Greaves agreed to one test flight, not because he trusted the idea, but because Hemsley's data was too consistent to ignore. The two men stood beneath a towering thundercloud the next evening, its crown lit by distant flashes. Hemsley pointed to a hand-drawn chart layered with altitudes, flash intervals, and sketches of where he believed the empty pockets drifted inside the storm. According to him, these pockets formed when charge differentials between ice crystals and supercooled droplets twisted the storm's electrical field. The distortion weakened radar reflections, creating narrow corridors where an aircraft might pass unseen. Greaves studied the notes with the skepticism of a man who had flown through storms and buried friends who had not. Still, he agreed to take a small reconnaissance craft along the predicted path. The moment they entered the cloud, the aircraft shuddered under a blast of cold air. Lightning flashed so close it bleached the cockpit white. For several seconds, the altimeter spun in frantic loops as the updrafts punched the wings. Then, just as Hemsley had drawn it, the turbulence eased. The sky dimmed into a strange gray hollow, a momentary calm wrapped inside violent weather. Instruments steadied, but their radio turned to static. Back on the ground, radar crews watched the aircraft vanish from their screens for the exact duration Hemsley predicted, 42 seconds in total. The test proved the blind zone was real, but it also showed how unpredictable it could become when the storm shifted. With proof finally in hand, Hemsley began building a method that was equal parts science and instinct. He studied storm maturity cycles, mapped lightning intervals, and tracked how electrical charge drifted through the towering cloud columns. From these observations came a crude system pilots could follow. Flashes counted in sets of 3, altitude bands aligned with the storm's evolving spine, and timing windows that opened for only a minute or two before collapsing again. It was never elegant, but in wartime, precision often yielded to what simply worked. Greaves became the translator between the science and the cockpit. He gathered his squadron in the briefing room and explained the technique in terms they trusted. Keep to the altitude line, follow the flash rhythm, and ride the updraft borders without drifting into the core. The risks were obvious, but the promise was stronger. An entire formation could slip past German radar, appearing only after they had already crossed into defended airspace. The first operational trials were tense. Crews braced for hailstones, violent jolts, and instruments that flickered like dying lamps. Yet the results stunned command. German radar stations failed to track entire groups of bombers, reporting blank screens at the precise moments the squadrons flew through the predicted blind pockets. But danger accumulated quietly. Pilots reported storm corridors narrowing faster than expected, lightning webs shifting in unpredictable loops, and sudden pockets of air so unstable they nearly rolled heavy aircraft onto their sides. Hemsley saw the warning signs developing long before anyone else. The storms were aging differently now, reacting unpredictably to seasonal changes. And still, each mission request grew more urgent. The breaking point arrived on a night when the weather charts were already turning against them. A massive storm system rolled in from the North Sea, its anvil spreading wide enough to swallow the horizon. Hemsley studied the readings with a tightening jaw. The electrical fields were shifting too quickly, the blind pockets opening and closing in chaotic patterns. He urged command to delay the mission, warning that the corridor they relied on would collapse before the squadron reached the far side. But headquarters, pressed by intelligence reports and shrinking opportunity, overruled him. The trick had worked too many times for hesitation now. Greaves led the formation into the storm with the same steady voice that had carried his men through dozens of missions. At first, the method held. The flash rhythm matched Hemsley's notes, and the turbulence followed the expected steps of storm maturity. Then, the structure changed. The blind zone narrowed abruptly, squeezing the aircraft into a corridor barely wide enough for a fighter, let alone bombers. Instruments flickered, altimeters dipped, and the sky convulsed around them. Lightning branched in horizontal sheets, striking so close the metal vibrated like a tuning fork. Updrafts yanked aircraft upward, while hail the size of fists smashed into fuselages. One bomber vanished into a rotating shaft of cloud, its engines muffled by the roar of collapsing air. Another broke formation when a sudden downdraft nearly flipped it. On the ground, radar operators saw the usual vanishing point, but far fewer echoes emerged on the other side. Only a handful of tattered aircraft limped back to base, their pilots pale, shaken, and convinced the storm had folded over them like a closing fist. Watch to find out what became of the man who uncovered the storm's hidden corridors. In the quiet months that followed, the storm trick faded from official memory. Reports were sealed, flight logs stripped of detail, and the technique filed away as a hazardous experiment that had outlived its usefulness. Only those who flew the missions, or briefed them, understood what had truly happened inside the thunderheads. For them, the sky had never looked the same again. Hemsley withdrew from frontline operations soon after the disastrous mission. Some said he requested reassignment. Others believed command quietly moved him aside to prevent further risk. What is certain is that he returned to pure meteorology, spending his remaining wartime years studying storm structures with the same steady focus he once brought to the blind zones. Greaves visited him once, walking into a room lined with maps, charge charts, and notebooks filled with the patterns that had both protected and destroyed. They spoke little about the past, neither needed to. In later decades, fragments of their story surfaced in declassified research into radar interference, where Hemsley's wartime notes were quietly referenced, never mentioned by name, but unmistakable in their detail. Pilots who survived that final mission described the sensation of flying through a natural shield that shifted with every breath of the storm, a force powerful enough to hide them, yet unpredictable enough to swallow those who trusted it too far. The moral was never written down, but it lived in the memory of those who knew. The sky offers shelter only briefly, and only to those who understand that nature has limits, even war cannot bend.